Welcome to the Real Life Buyer podcast. In this podcast, you will hear interviews with business owners, entrepreneurs, thought leaders, authors, and technical specialists in their field. These professionals will hasten your development, accelerate your career, and broaden your business know-how. Now, introducing your host, Dave Barr, interviewing with a purchasing twist.
Hello and welcome to the Real Life Buyer. Today's guest is David Edwards, the author of Knew You, Who Knew, winner of the Literary Titan Gold Award in April 2022. David has a BA in business, an MBA in healthcare administration, and for 35 years has worked with doctors, dentists, counsellors, and community health workers to serve the people on lower incomes to get the help and support they need in life. It is through this work David felt compelled to produce his book to communicate the science-based tools needed for people to understand the principles and motivation required to succeed. Today, I'm looking to explore these 10 enduring principles of motivation and discover how they may help you achieve your goals in business and life. So I have the tremendous pleasure of welcoming David onto the podcast. Hi, David.
Hey, Dave.
How are you doing? You all good?
I'm good, thank you.
Excellent.
It's a beautiful morning here in Washington State.
Lovely. So, your book. Before we get to the book in detail, would you mind kind of unpacking the key moments in your career and the epiphany you experienced either before or during writing this book?
I'd love to. And as I talk about this, people might, I think, justifiably think I'm a little slow. But, we each do our best. So I started off going to college and working. I was working as an accounting clerk or a bookkeeper, if you will. And I worked my way into the business office and I became the chief financial officer or finance director of a small nonprofit, but it was growing rapidly. We had tripled in size in 6 years. And I was the young buck. We got the very first PC that anybody had ever seen. And I was the kid, right? I had hair. It was brown. I had a mustache because, it had just gotten through the 70s and everybody had to have a mustache. But we got the computer and it was $7,000.
Wow.
And it had a 13-inch color monitor. And the CPU was like a 286, if it was that. Yeah. If anybody remembers way back in those days.
Yeah.
And it had dual floppy drives. There was no hard drive. And so I would stick the program in with one floppy drive and the other floppy drive, I would then record the work I did. And I took our accounts payable system, which was all in ledgers that we did by hand, and I put it on the computer. Right. And I figured this is a lot easier. You don't have to transfer, from the bottom of one page to the top of the other. So I'm dating myself a little bit, but, things evolve, obviously. And I really enjoyed working in healthcare, but then I thought I'd try something different. And I just stepped away for just a short while and realized I love healthcare. I like that this is all about people. And to me, that was really important. And so I worked with the elderly. I worked in cardiology. I worked in Africa for a while. I worked with tribal groups in Alaska. Do people know where Alaska is?
Yeah, I believe so.
In England?
Yeah, indeed,
Anyways,
yes.
Up in Alaska, I was able to do a lot of things. But the last 10 years in particular, kind of building on a long career, I had this idea. We were building a new building, right? We were really excited. I was the CEO of this health center. I had moved my office into a closet to make room for providers to have an office. And then I moved out of my closet so we could put 3 dentists in my closet. That's how tight things were. And we knew we needed a new building. But we'd been very successful over the last few years. We had money to actually, get credit to be able to buy a new building or build a new building. We had a much better reputation. Our quality had gone from the middle of the road to the best in our region consistently. we had actually eliminated any disparities in health outcomes between the minority populations we served and the majority populations, which is very, very rare. Anyways, we had done all these really good things, and we were in a really good position. And we had built a model of care that was built around you, Dave, and all of the listeners and watchers being a whole person. Can you imagine that? Healthcare designed around you as a whole person. You got a head, a brain, a mouth, shoulders, a cardiovascular system. You've got kidneys and bowels and feet and all that stuff. And shockingly, it's all connected. So we're trying to look at you as a whole person and work with you as that whole person. And so as we were building this building, I had dentists and doctors and therapists and health coaches and nurses and all these wonderful folks. We had this epiphany, my first of several actually. And I realized that unless we help the patient fulfill their role as the captain of this care team, as the one who's in charge of their own health, in other words, responsible for their own health, and we're just here to help them, right? Unless they can fulfill that role better, all of this work on technology and design and staffing and process and all these things, that you think about when you're doing that kind of a project, that it would be for naught. I mean, it would be nice to have a bigger building. It would be nice to have biophilic design, which is a fun word, in the design of the building and all these cool things. But if we miss this one thing, we're really going to miss the mark. We're going to fail to achieve what we wanted to. And that's not what we're all about, right? We want to achieve the goals that we set out. And so I honestly was just started asking people and having dialogue. Well, what does this even mean, really? What are the skills? What is this magic thing that we know is there, but we don't really understand? And so we started to try to understand it. And it came down to change, right? Change is all around us, right? So there's the change, for example, back in the days when I was swapping floppy disks in order to save my program, right? To today, when we're on a Zoom call across the entire United States and the Atlantic Ocean, and it just is seamless. And so things change all around us, and they constantly do, right? So we've got to keep up with that change. But perhaps more importantly, even, is the change that goes on in ourselves, right? Because when we're talking health, we're talking about the change inside ourselves and how we both respond to it and how we act proactively towards it, right? So we can, as much as is possible, become the captain of change in our own lives, in our own bodies, in our own minds. Does that make sense so far?
Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
So I started studying what we call in psychology change models. And there's some fancy words like the trans-theoretical model of change. And anyways, there's a number of different models that are well thought of, that have a good research base. You would think change is a simple thing and it's just step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and we would all agree on it. But, anything that has to do with human beings is just not that simple, evidently, right? One cancer drug that works for Dave Barr may not work for Dave Edwards, right? Because while our genetic makeup, our DNA is 99.9% that same, that 0.1% makes all the difference in the world. And it really doesn't matter who we are, right? I could be a Black man. I could be Asian. I could be from India. It could be anything. We're 99.9% the same, but that 0.1% changes our skin color, maybe our nose. You got big ears or not if you're bald, if you got hair, all these little things that are relatively trivial, as well as some fairly important things as well. But anyways, I get a little bit askew here. So change, it's about change and managing change. And as I studied these change models, as I was a finance officer for a lot of years, a couple of decades, in fact, I like spreadsheets, right? And so I lined these change models up. And the second epiphany I had was that at the very top of every one of these change models was this idea of intrinsic or personal motivation. So this isn't if you accomplish this goal, right? If you can shave 3% in cost of purchasing our raw materials, you'll get a bonus, right? Well, that's motivation. Or if you guys meet this deadline, you'll get this spiff or this, trip to France or whatever it is, right? And so we have all these kinds of external motivations, right? And they're very powerful. I don't mean to denigrate them or whatever. The problem is that they act on us, but they do very little to change us. They change our behavior in the short term, but they generally don't do a very good job of changing who we are, right? So they have their power and they're very powerful, but they also have pretty serious limitations. So what we're talking about is the change, that things that we decide to do, the things that we want to do. People talk about their passions, right? What drives them or those kinds of things. This is what comes from inside of us, not from out. And it ends up that this is the key to being not only the captain of your care team, but as I studied the principles of this intrinsic motivation, they really are universal. They apply to all domains of our life. It could be at work, it could be at home, it could be just as an individual person, in our social groups, in our physical self, our mental self, our social self, all of these domains and aspects of life, it is universal. It applies across the board, which to me made it that much more powerful because there's really no aspect of ourselves that this isn't helpful for. Tracking so far?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, beautiful. So, and this is how I discovered the 10 principles. I mean, and you would think after, graduate school and a lot of work and experience that this would have discovered this a long time ago. And honestly, I was looking for some resource that I could look at, where somebody lined this out for me. And while there's bits and pieces in different places, there really wasn't anybody that had put these pieces together that I could find, especially for lay people. I have some great books. I have this, the Oxford Handbook of Human Motivation. Yep. This is not a page turner, I promise you, but it's a marvelous book. And yep. Dr. Albert Bandura really invented, he didn't invent, he discovered and researched and studied some of the key components of these 10 principles. In fact, 6 of the 10 principles under this area that they call self-efficacy. So there's really 3 areas. Our values, not a vague sense of our values, but specific core values that are explicit. There are the 6 principles of what's called self-efficacy. This is the exercise of control. This is what really makes me the captain of my life. And then there's the 3 principles of self-compassion. And this is basically what makes me human. The self-compassion and the self-efficacy balance each other on a foundation of our values. And those 3 areas, it's in those 3 areas that we find the 10 principles.
Yeah, well, that's good. Let's dive into the first one because I have done a little bit of research here, trying to get my head around what it is you put together. And we touch on values. And the first thing, obviously, is what we determine is the definition of a value. And something that occurred to me straight away is there are different types of values. There are the kind of personal values, for example, but there's also things like values that you instill in your business or in your profession. So in this instance, what do you determine is the definition of values?
So values are guides, and they are guides that are very personal, and they provide, they help us understand things that are the most important to us. I mean, that's the shortest version of it. Right. So if you think about, for example, one of my core personal values is transparency. Transparency, right? And so I walk people in the first chapter of the book through a process. It's very simple. It takes most people less than 2 hours to do this, and it doesn't cost anything else. So it's free, which is nice.
Lovely.
And yet the benefits of this for an individual are a greater sense of our own purpose, like our own purpose in life, a greater sense of well-being, a sense that my life is okay. It's in the direction that I want it to be. Greater focus and less regret. So those are good things, right, in life?
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah, indeed.
Yeah.
Certainly the regret.
Well, we reduce languishing. So what do we see a lot of today, right? We see depression, languishing, burnout, people with fuzzy thinking. They're just not, they can't quite figure out what's important. They have these vague, nagging, uncomfortable feelings or these positive, nice feelings, but they've not taken time to make these things explicit. And so they lack power in their life. And so there's really 3 steps. It's really fairly straightforward. I offer a list of 117 common values. You work through that list and I help you do that. You get down to your 5 core values. I was listening to a podcast the other day and the guy, these are my 14 core values. I'm going, oh my gosh. I don't know if you remember this, Dave, but back in the 90s, late 90s, probably balanced scorecards were very popular.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. Yeah.
Right? We have all these trends in our business lives, right? And so, and I like balanced scorecards, right? I thought this was a great idea and kind of building off of re-engineering, I think. And so I was working with a friend or talking with a friend who worked at a big hospital. And she said, I've been working on my balanced scorecard. And she was a CEO of one of the hospitals in this chain, a smaller one. And she said, I've got these 27 things. And I thought, oh my gosh.
I think you're pretty busy.
And I said, what was her name now? Sarah? Sarah, I said, just think about this. Do you remember what you had for dinner last night? Can you remember 27 things? Are you going to ask your staff to remember 27 things? I mean, that's just a recipe for disaster. And candidly, a couple of years later, it was completely useless because you can't track 27 things. We can't, there's the original reason that phone numbers, I don't know about in England, but in the US, phone numbers are 7 digits. Because that's about all anybody can remember is 7 digits. And that's why they designed it that way.
Yeah.
Anyways, so 5 things. It's a round number. It could be 4. It could be 6. Make it your own. It's personal, right? But I think 5 is a nice, memorable number. And so what I ask people to do is the first thing is to define each value. So, for example, for me, transparency is that I don't have a hidden agenda. When I talk to Dave and I talk to Mary and I talk to Sam and Jose, every one of them, I'm saying the same thing. I have no hidden agenda. I don't have multiple versions of my story. I don't have the pitch for this guy and the pitch for that guy, right? It's all the same. And I think when I do that, that's how I define it. So that's the first step. The second step is to describe what life is like or what your behavior is like when you're living that value. So I define that for myself, for example, that I tell people the same story, that I don't have a hidden agenda, right? So it may not be comfortable, but I'd rather tell you now up front the uncomfortable thing than wait till later and becomes a soap opera or a sitcom or something, which in real life isn't very much fun. And so you describe what that looks like in my behavior. And then finally, you described, why am I better off? Why is my life better for living that value? And so for me, I don't ever have to remember which story I told, right? So for my mental baggage, it's very simple because it just is what it is. And so we do that for each of our values. And as you can see, it doesn't have to be complicated. We're not writing a page for each one of these things. It's very simple, a couple of lines. And you can fit, usually for 5 values, you can fit this on a single page, maybe a little bit onto the back if you're a little more verbose, or a little less than a full page if you're very concise. And so this process is really powerful. And you mentioned there are different domains where you have different values, right? You might have different values at work as a very common example. Almost all of us have to deal with that. And this is really powerful. Do you ever use Google Maps?
Indeed,
or
I do, yes.
MapQuest or something like that?
Yeah.
Let's say that you're in a new town that you haven't been before. Have you ever been to Bordeaux, France, for example?
I have actually, yeah.
Oh, well, bless your heart. Well, I lived in Bordeaux for a while, a long time ago, 40 years ago. And if you found a really great restaurant that you wanted to go to in downtown Bordeaux and you're in the outskirts of town, what are the two things that you need to know in order to get there?
Well, where you are and where you want to get to, I guess.
Exactly, right? You need to know where you are and you need to know where you want to get to. So you know where you want to get to, but let's just say you don't have a map in front of you and you have no idea where you are. How easy is it to get from where you don't know you are? It could be up here, it could be right there, it could be right over, you don't know where it is, but you know where you want to go. It's not going to work very well, is it?
Yep. You're very reliant on other people.
Exactly. Well, in fact, my wife and I went to Bordeaux. We'd been married 36 years now, but 15 years ago, I went back to France for the first time. And it was night. We'd taken the train in and got in the car, and it was dark. And if you've been to Bordeaux, you notice that the street signs aren't like at eye level. They're way up high on the side of the buildings. And we had a map, and my wife was the navigator. Of course, the map is in French, which was okay for me, but not for her, because I speak French and she doesn't. But I'm trying to drive through these narrow streets, and we got completely lost. We had no idea where we were, and it was impossible to get to our hotel. So we're tired and frustrated, and we end up parking and asking people, hey, where are we? Can you find it on the map for us? And eventually, like at midnight, we did get there where we needed to go. But that's really a hard way to do it. Yeah. So we think about company values and our personal values. If the company has values that they think are important, and they're not going to be identical to an individual's values, right? But every thoughtful company I've ever worked for, or that you've ever worked for, would like you to understand what the company's values are to make them actionable in your life, right? So you actually, hopefully, live their values, and it's not just a facade or, a lack of transparency, right? And so that's what a thoughtful company wants, and that's quite reasonable. But if you don't have any sense of what your own values are, and you're asked to draw a course to the company's values, how successful is that going to be? Yep. Right? It's going to be very difficult because you have to understand what your own values are, because if the company's values are, especially their lived values, if they're inconsistent enough, then you're going to be miserable at your job. And very likely you're going to need to change your values, which I don't recommend that for a job. Or you're going to want to find another employer who has values that are more consistent with yours. But if you don't even know what yours are, you just have this vague sense of them, Yep. It's not going to be very powerful and actionable for you as you draw this line between what I value personally, what's important to me and that provide my guideposts, and what the company is asking me to do. And so I think as an employer who is thoughtful, probably one of the easiest things you can do, one of the cheapest things you could do, is to help your employees make their own personal core values explicit. Think of it as a gift that's going to help them at work, but also in every other domain of their life.
Yeah, very interesting. I like that.
There we go.
The next stage, or the next set of things you highlight, are awareness and feedback. Just a few words from you on what awareness are you seeking, and where do you get the feedback from?
So feedback is all around us, right? I mean, feedback is in every conversation we have, in the reports we get. It's just all around us. I think the key for most of us is to develop a healthy relationship with feedback. Because very often when we think of feedback, we think of that bad performance review. When our boss told us, well, you didn't quite, make the mark on this one. Or, if you're in purchasing, right, you have a vendor who is giving you this feedback that this relationship isn't working for us, right? Feedback is everywhere. So the key, though, is, do I welcome feedback? Do I resist it, right? Am I pushing back on the feedback, or do I leave the feedback channels open? And so I think that's the key with feedback. So far as awareness, there's really two kinds of awareness. There's awareness, mostly like what we were just talking about, awareness of what's going on around us, right? So what's going on in our environment? And again, this is universal. This could be at work. It could be feedback from coworkers, or kind of, what the environment in our unit is, the company, where it's going, vendors, relationships, right? There's feedback about what's going on around us. And there's also, perhaps more importantly, they're both important, but anyways, equally important is feedback that comes from inside. That's about who we are becoming, right? So there's really kind of two lenses on feedback.
Okay, that's interesting.
And without feedback, again, how do you know where you're at in order to get to where you're going?
Yeah, it's your measuring stick, isn't it? Yeah.
It's your measuring stick. And it's your measure of progress along the way. So, for example, when we were lost in Bordeaux in 2003, we had to follow the map, right? And say, no, turn left, right? At this corner. And we're looking up, trying to make sure we can see the signs in the dark. But, once you make that left, you've got some feedback. All right, this looks right, because we're on Rue de Champagne, or something. And we're getting feedback that this is the right place we need to be until we turn left. That's, Rue de Charles de Gaulle or something.
Okay.
Anyways, and so the feedback is an ongoing process. And that helps us to know that we started here, and we're on track to getting to where we want to go over here.
Right. You then move on to learning. Is this a learning, and holistic learning, as you constantly look for new things to understand, or are you meaning in an academic sense to try and achieve a certain qualification? Or does it matter as long as you keep trying to develop yourself?
I think it doesn't matter. But my focus in the book is less on academic learning, I would say, and more on learning from life. So we give the first two principles. We have our values, this foundational place, what's important to us. We have a healthy relationship with feedback and awareness, right? So we've got some simple tools. So we're aware of what's going on around us and what's going on inside of us, right? And then we take that and we learn. Right? So you can have feedback that you don't learn from. We see this in business all the time. People stop buying product X. Well, what's going on? And you look at the sales chart and it goes down and down and down, and you don't know what's going on, right? We're kind of clueless because over here, product Y is doing this. And so overall, we think we're okay. But we're ignoring this feedback that we're getting that something's wrong over here. We're no longer meeting needs, or, we don't know what it is until we investigate further, right? So feedback often isn't a solution or an answer, but it's an indication that something requires more thought, more insight, more research, more effort, whatever it is.
Yeah. Okay.
And so this learning is really the process of taking this experience that we're open to and making sure we learn from it. And in the business, one of the best examples of this, that's going back a little ways, was the Lisa computer. Do you remember what the Lisa computer was?
No, I'm afraid I don't.
So Lisa was the first graphical user interface computer created by Apple. And it was an abject failure. It tanked. It did not sell well. It never did, and they eventually just pulled it off the market. And you would think of that as an abject failure. But what they did with Lisa, while it was a market failure, it was a massive success because of what they learned from it. And they took everything that they learned from this Lisa computer, how they built it, how they marketed it, how that user interface worked. All of these components. And in the second iteration you might have heard of is called the Macintosh computer. And, which, is a huge, massive success.
Yeah.
And so what they did was they said, we have a failure here. Instead of tossing it out and saying this was garbage, they said, what could we learn from this? What's the feedback that we got? And what do we learn from it? And then how do we make the next iteration that much better so that it's going to be successful, right? So this is really about having a relationship that says, I'm learning from success which is kind of normal, right? This went well because we did this, but also learning from failures, because there's always some golden nuggets in those disasters, right? And what do they say? I think most forward-looking organizations today, companies, say failure is not a failure unless we didn't learn from it, right?
Yep.
So that's this healthy way to look at learning as an ongoing, lifelong process.
Perfect. Yeah. Even though it's a tough lesson, it's a good lesson. Yeah.
It's a tough lesson, so really tough.
Yeah. Yeah. You then move on to intentionality and setback. Can you explain what your definitions of these are and how they should be used, applied, and utilized, perhaps?
Have you ever had a setback, Dave?
Quite a few.
It is common to the human condition. It's common in business. It's common in life. It is. I have never worked any place. So at this last place where I had these epiphanies, we doubled in size in about 4 years. And it wasn't like Zoom, just like this, right? It was, I mean, that's just the way life is. Most of the time, anyway. There are exceptions. There's always exceptions. So intentionality is basically this idea that I want to be the captain of my own life, because you have a partner, a spouse, perhaps, a girlfriend, boyfriend, you have parents, you have an employer, you have every day about 3,000 images on your phone, on your tablet, on your computer, on the subway, on the billboards, everywhere you look. I mean, there are ads on the shopping carts in the United States. I don't know if they've got those in England, but I mean, the shopping cart has an ad on it, from the local real estate office or whatever it is, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there are ads everywhere. We see about 3,000 on any given day. And they all want us to prioritize what they're selling, right? So whether it's profound, like in a relationship or with your employer, or trivial, all of these ads and marketers who want our attention, they want us to prioritize what's important to them. The key here is that you are intentional about your own life. And so if your biggest goal in life is to be on constant vacation in southern Spain, good for you, right? That's going to be very meaningful for you. But if that isn't in your top 5 core values, right, that isn't the most important thing, I want you, and the whole point of this chapter is that you be intentional about what it is you do want. You should have your own goals. And you may have goals with your employer and goals in your family, which is all great. But at some point, you should have your own passions, your own interests, your own goals, both about what you want to do. And I think this is very important. If you didn't get anything else from this, please listen to this very carefully. You also have to have goals around who you want to become. Oh, and Jasper has joined us in the room here. My golden retriever. But anyways, so all of us have goals about what we want to do. Shockingly few of us have goals about who we want to become. But it is so important, because it is if we don't focus on that at least a little bit, I think I say something like this in the book. I would, if I could quote my own book, I'll paraphrase my own book. If you don't set some goals around who you are becoming, at some point in your life, it will become the rate limiting factor on what you actually do.
Yeah.
Because unless you build your own capacity over time, at some point, you won't be able to do anything more. You will have reached the limit of what you can do.
Yeah.
And then you have these things we talked about earlier: burnout, frustration, discouragement, depression. That's a lot of that is that our doing has exceeded our capacity, our becoming.
Yeah.
And so we find ourselves in this deplorable situation where we far too often approach catastrophic failure, which in a human being looks like the things we just talked about.
Yeah,
we want to avoid those, right?
Going back to your earlier point about intentionality, I guess the key here is as we were talking about marketing, being bombarded by, it's like 3,000, you say, adverts a day, the intentionality in those should enable you, hopefully, to filter out all those distractions and keep you on track. Would that be fair to say?
Exactly right. And there's some marvelous things that our human nature help us. There's something called a reticular activating system. Have you heard of that?
I have indeed.
Yeah, a RAS, right? And so what happens if somebody's not familiar with it? So let's say that you never thought about it before, but all of a sudden you've reached this point and that you really want a Mini Countryman. It's a new car, you want a red one, and you just think that's the coolest car in the world. Nobody paid me to do this. So, and so you just think that would be awesome. All of a sudden, what happens is your reticular activating system opens up and you notice there's Mini Countrymen all over the place. So you'd never even noticed them before, right? Because your brain cannot process everything that's in the environment. It's just not possible. There's too much, especially in this day and age. Right. And so what your brain does is once you have identified, these are my values, these are my intentions, these are things that are important to me, the things that don't fall into those get filtered out automatically. Not everything, obviously. We still get our phone out and get down into a TikTok chain for 20 minutes. All of a sudden you go, what happened? Right. Yep. So it's not perfect, but it really is super powerful and super effective. And then once we've identified and made these things explicit, all of a sudden it says, I'm going to open up my mind like that Mini Countryman, right? All of a sudden I see them all over the place, right? Because I've opened up my mind to that. So people talk about possibility thinking or manifesting or, these kinds of things. It's really a fairly simple automatic process that you benefit from by doing these simple foundational steps, like making your values explicit, being intentional, learning from your feedback that you get. And, these steps, as you can see, they build on each other.
Yeah.
It's very difficult to be intentional if you don't have a good relationship with feedback, right? It's very difficult to then set plans, kind of the next step in this process, right? Which is making plans.
Yeah.
And in making plans is where I really talk about both your doing and your becoming types of plans or goals, right?
Yeah.
And then the next step is to actually accomplish them, right? Because accomplishing things, as you know very well, is a different set of skills than making the plans to accomplish them. But they're both critical because you can't just execute without having this thoughtful, sets of goals that are aligned with your intent and your feedback and your values and your awareness, right? These all build on each other to create success.
Right. So that's where the next three were, just so the audience pick up on that. There is the creating plans, setting goals, and I think you call it the doing or the action steps to achieve those things. Is there any particular things you say? A lot of people write goals down, particularly high-level goals, but often don't follow through with those goals and therefore achieve the doing. Do you say the key really is to break those down into small bite-sized chunks and achieve each of those, give yourselves little hits as you achieve each one, rather than try and tackle too much too quickly?
Exactly. There is a interesting paradox when it comes to goals and how our minds work. Most of the intrinsic motivation that we have is going to be towards the bigger, longer term goals, right? And unfortunately, though, those are the hardest things to accomplish because they're complicated, right? They're long term. That might take months, years even to achieve or accomplish or to make progress on. There might be goals, for example, that I set for myself and who I'm becoming that I may never fully achieve. But all I can do is track progress. Am I making progress over time? And so, there's different goals, but the way the mind works is the most intrinsic motivation is aligned with those bigger goals because those are most likely aligned with our values, the things that are most important to us, like a relationship with a spouse if that's really important to you, if that, if you look at your values, that's really foundational, that's never done. That's an ongoing process. So you have to pay attention to it. And as soon as you don't, right, we talk about taking relationships for granted, those kinds of things, right? So this is a lifelong thing. Other things like, for example, maybe you want to go on vacation in southern Spain, right? So maybe you start planning that out a year ahead. So you make sure you get your time off from work, and you got all these steps, this planning process that you do. You get your reservations, you make sure save your money, you do all these various things. And so these longer term goals tend to be aligned with, and we have a lot of intrinsic motivation to accomplish them, right? The challenge is though maintaining that motivation. And so one of the ways you do that is you break up those big goals into small steps, because what small steps allow you to do is to have feedback. And that feedback, as we talked about earlier, right, is the building of these things. It is the ongoing feedback that, we've made our reservations. Check the box. I don't know about you, but it's still satisfying for me is to check the box.
Yeah.
And then you go on to the next thing, right? So what's the next step? Well, you got to make sure we have a car for while we're down there. So we're going to drive over, go through under the tunnel, or are we going to fly over and rent, or what are we going to do, right? So you just go through and you make the plan, and then you don't have to do it all at once, but you check the box. You got this done. I got that done. And over time, you accomplish, what you set out to do.
Yeah.
And so there's the balance of the long term and the short term. The short term tends to be less intrinsically satisfying because it's not aligned with the goal specifically, like renting a car, whatever. It's just renting a car. But when you go, oh no, that's a part of how I'm maintaining my relationship with my spouse, which is really important to me. So you see how these things build and they support. But if you don't have any intent and you don't know what your values are, you're much less likely to pursue those things.
Yeah.
So the meaning in your life, the joy in your life, the spontaneity in your life, even though you've got goals and plans and you're executing on them, right? By doing that, you actually increase your spontaneity. You increase your joy, you increase your meaning, you increase your sense of well-being. And isn't that really what life is all about?
Indeed, yeah. Yeah, it's really good. I've tended to, looking at the last four, I've tended to lump those together because I think the other things I do very functionally, but the next four being belief, self-kindness, common humanity, and mindlessness, for me, kind of come together. So you also mention in your book about affirmations in this area, and that feels a bit more spiritual in some respects. And some people perhaps have a problem with dealing with those intangible things. So how would you sum up these final four?
So what these are the balance to this self-efficacy, right? So these getting things done skills are balanced with our skills that we develop around what is called self-compassion, and they balance each other. Getting stuff done is great. Remembering that we're human beings is essential as well. We're not machines, right? We're human beings. And so we want to balance these two kind of aspects of our life so that we don't fall over, frankly. So we avoid catastrophic failure. We've known people who achieve, and they get to, some point and they go, I have no idea what I'm doing. Nothing's important. This doesn't matter to me anymore, right? They've lost track of their humanity, their self-compassion, their common humanity. And so what we want to do is we want to keep these things in balance. So belief falls under both. It's kind of in the middle of the book.
Yeah.
Because it falls as a component of self-efficacy, of getting things done. Because I'll ask you this question. If you believe you can do something, is that a guarantee that it's going to happen?
Not a guarantee, but it certainly does motivate you if you've got that self-belief.
Absolutely it does, right? It helps, but it's not a guarantee. But what if you absolutely are convinced you cannot do something? If you believe fully, you just can't do it.
Then you'll definitely succeed.
You will definitely succeed in not doing it, right?
Exactly, yes.
And so belief is it's an odd construct. And I put it there in the middle, but scientifically, in the psychological research, I'm sorry, I'm trying to fight the movement of the sun out of the eastern window here. Sorry.
The sun is shining on you. That's a good thing, Dave.
This is a good thing. That's right. Okay, so what happens is belief is like happiness. It's not something that we generally can actively pursue, right? Because happiness is a result of living your values and pursuing your dreams in a consistent way. And you will be happy if you do that. But it's not like, I'm going to be happy, I'm going to set a goal, I'm going to be happy, and these are the 8 steps. Happiness just doesn't work that way. And the same with belief. Belief is the result of this step-by-step process that we just identified. You know your values, you have awareness, you have intention, you learn, right? As you do these things, you develop a belief that, hey, I did this before, I can do this again. Or I succeeded in this little area, now I'm going to succeed in the next, level above that, right? So belief is a process that grows over time as a result of all these other things that, you've made a part of your life, these aligning your life with these principles. So belief isn't something that, and I stuck it there for that reason, is that it's really the accumulation of all these other principles. But belief is important for what we just talked about, because without it, we're toast.
Yeah.
Anyways, it also then feeds into these self-compassion principles, which I know we're getting short on time. So the first one is simply to be kind to yourself. Far too many of us were raised, maybe at home, maybe from our friends, maybe at school even, the old teacher with a ruler whacking your fingers, or whatever. I got spanked in elementary school because that was normal. Nowadays, you could never do that. But anyways, we tend to think, if I mess up, if I fall short, that the best thing for me to do is to beat myself up, right? I'm just going to browbeat myself, you dummy, you idiot, how could you do that? I can't believe that, right? We have this kind of language that we engage with in our own minds. The problem is what the research tells us is, if I have a problem and I start browbeating myself, what a dummy. What happens is my capacity to successfully deal with that problem decreases.
Absolutely right. Yeah.
But if I treat myself with kindness, like would a close friend or family member, can you imagine you're going through a hard time? Your sister calls you up and says, "You moron, I can't believe you did that." Is that how your sister acts most likely? If it does, I'm sorry, that's not normal. You should know that is not normal. Mostly your sister's going to say what?
Well, try and get over it. She'll try and comfort you, try and make you feel better about yourself.
Exactly. This isn't you, Dave. I know you're better than this, right? And so if we talk to ourselves with self-kindness, like a close friend or family member would, our capacity to deal with that problem goes up. So do we want to sabotage ourselves, or do we want to help ourselves? And this isn't like letting yourself off the hook. This isn't like avoiding accountability. It's not like that. It's simply recognizing that we're a human being, that we are human. We're not perfect, right? We have never met a perfect person, and we are not ourselves. So this is normal to the human condition. So you might as well be kind to yourself to give yourself that leg up so you can do better next time.
Yeah.
So that's what self-kindness is in its simplest form.
Yeah. I guess, you say it's accepting that, okay, something's gone wrong. We talked about earlier on, how we can learn from that. And then if you put yourself in a positive frame of mind, how can you then go back and try and resolve or deal with that issue? Otherwise, you're in a spiral of despair, and all you can think about is the way you failed. And that doesn't help you move forward and try and dig your way out of this problem in any way, shape, or form.
Exactly. It's this. What happens is when we focus on the failure, the mistake, the whatever it is, and we ruminate. The ruminating is this process of rehearsing and rehashing again and again. And that, once or twice, is really helpful, going back to the earlier principle, if we are learning from it, right? Not ruminating on it to make ourselves feel bad, but to learn from it. So, for example, a very personal example, I was fired from this job that I loved and that we had been so successful at. I was fired. I was distraught. I mean, the board chairman called me in and said, David, you're fired. Thank you for your service. Wow.
Yeah.
Why? What's going on? Right? Sorry, we can't talk about that. I can't give you any feedback. And the human resources person from outside, anyways, so this is a traumatic experience. I fired people. Never like that. I guarantee you, because I don't feel like I was treated like a human being. I was treated like I was a cog in a machine. I no longer fit in the machine, so we're going to get rid of this cog. Yeah. And that's not right. That's unfortunate, right? That's not humane. It's not looking at us as a human being. But it happened, right? And one of the things I did, because I'm a little bit of a researcher, was as I was writing the book, and I was thinking about this, I did some research. I found out that in the United States, 50,000 people are fired or laid off every single day.
Wow. Huge
50,000 people. So that day, well, I was feeling this was very personal, right? This is me and my job and my livelihood and my house payment and all that stuff. I was one of 50,000 people that got fired or laid off that day. And you know what? The next day, another 50,000 people, and the next day, another. So what thing that stood for me, kind of going into the next principle, which is the sense of our common humanity, is that no matter how alone I feel in this circumstance, no matter how unique I feel, like nobody else has ever had a breakup, nobody else has ever been fired, nobody ever else had a bad day at work or had a project that failed on them or a deal that fell through or, whatever it is, their vacation that they planned for a year carefully going through all the steps and they're so successful. And then, the month before you traveled, the pandemic hits, right? These things happen. And they're really not, most of them are not that uncommon. So we are not alone in our common humanity. And to recognize that we're all human beings, stuff happens. This is normal life. And that we don't have to be sent off the deep end as a result. We can take the principles, right? We can build on those principles and say, this is the challenge, but this is typical to the human condition. So what do I learn from it? What's the feedback? What could I have done maybe, if this were to happen again? How can I be proactive and learn from this so it doesn't happen again, right? So we go through the steps, we go through the principles, and we continue to add more, if you will, the 3 T's, what I call the 3 T's, the tips, the tricks, and the techniques. There's a place for tips, tricks, and techniques. Unfortunately, what far too many of us do is that's all we focus on. Right? How do I do this better? What's the next level, right? We focus on that without the foundations. And what this book talks about, what I think is so important for all of us as human beings, is that we build these foundations of who we are becoming so that whatever life throws at us, in the good times and in the bad times, we are more successful than we would have been. Right. We're more able to be successful. We're more able to avoid catastrophic failure from, like a human condition. And then the last principle, which is I call mindlessness. And I did that because far too many of us have a bias about being mindful. We think of yoga pants and Ayurvedic, this or that or the other thing, and words we don't get, and, burning incense or something. And what I wanted to do is approach this from a point of, you've got a brain, I've got a brain. So mindlessness is not the lack of a brain, which is the most amazing creation in the universe, according to those who know these things. It's the fact of how I use or don't use my brain. So what I beg you to do is to kind of recognize if you've got a bias, but say, yeah, I got a brain. I want to use my brain. Right? Why not use my brain? And what are the advantages of using my brain? And to adopt a simple practice or two that encourage you, that make it a habit to use your brain every day. Can I leave you with something? I know our time is up. So we talked a lot about principles and, and kind of big high level stuff. But here's something that a watcher or a listener can take away. And I'm just fighting my sunshine again. Let me see if this helps. It helps a little bit, doesn't it? Anyways, here's something that everybody can take away. In the morning, start your day with intent. What is my intention for today? And you may have a calendar, like a paper calendar. You may have your calendar on your phone or your computer. I don't care. It doesn't make any difference. But write down what you want to accomplish and include both what you want to do and what you want to become. Don't put 17 things down. Please, that's just not possible, right? What is the overarching goal, your intent, right? And what do you want to become? So I would encourage people to choose one thing on the becoming side, right? I'm trying to become more meek myself. And people think, meek? Why would meekness? Who wants to be meek? I want to be bold, right? Well, you know what? Meekness, as it turns out, is bold. Meekness is simply recognizing I don't know everything. And I can learn from anybody. And I can learn from everybody that I interact with today. And so meekness is avoiding ego and pride and recognizing that as a whole person, I can learn from others, and that's my intent. So I start my day, I have in my intent, right? And my becoming side is I want to listen to everybody and think what I can learn from them. It may be somebody who's homeless. It may be my boss. It may be, I don't matter. It doesn't matter who it is. We can learn something from everybody. There is some feedback, right? There's some awareness there that's going to help me to be a better person. So that's what I'm working on, and I make it intentional in the morning. The other half of this habit is at the end of the day, you go through the day. You can mentally rehearse, you can review on your calendar, you can journal. There's lots of ways to do this. And the way you do it doesn't matter as much as the fact that you are doing something, right? That works for you. That's the key. So however you do that, you review and you're accountable. So I'm intentional in the morning. I'm accountable in the evening. And I say, how did I do? And if I start to browbeat because I messed up, right? I didn't do this, I didn't follow my intent, right? Then I catch myself, oh, I'm ruminating on this mistake. And then you step back and say, well, what are the principles? Oh, yeah, this was feedback. It's not right or wrong. It's not good or bad. It's just feedback. So what am I going to do with it? What do I learn from it, right? And then you say, tomorrow is another day. You get up in the morning. You're intentional. This is what I want to do. Yesterday, this is what I learned from what I messed up on or what I did well, right? We want to reinforce what went well as well. And then you go on through your day again. And then you're accountable. And it becomes a daily process. If you do this, you are using your mind, I guarantee you. And what happens is your mind is like, how can I say this? It's like a muscle. So when we exercise, you do curls, you're going to build your biceps, right? And this is a different process, but the idea is the same. What happens is by exercising that regularly, it gets bigger and stronger and more capable. By doing this very simple thing every day, what you're doing is you're building pathways in your mind. Those pathways start off as maybe a single synapse, but then it grows. And it only takes about an hour of effort to double the number of synapses. And then you double again, and then you double again. And all of a sudden, you have a superhighway. And what was difficult or awkward the first time you tried it becomes automatic because the plasticity of our brain, which everybody's brain works the same way, I promise you, it's exactly the same process. It becomes automatic. And after 30 days or 90 days, or, depending on what it is you're trying to do, it just becomes normal. It is, as I titled the book, a new you. Who knew?
Brilliant. That's a great way to finish. That's some fantastic information there. It's a lot of things to think about for people. How do people find more about you and what you do, and obviously find your book?
So the easiest way is just to go to my personal or author website, www.davidredwards.com.
Fantastic. Well, that's been really insightful discussion, Dave. Thank you very much for explaining through your book and the principles. I think that's a great opportunity for people to reflect now and obviously to follow up and perhaps put things into practice.
Let's hope so, right? That's how we benefit. That's how we will gain from it. Thank you, Dave. This has been a real pleasure.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. Take care, David.
Bye-bye.
So there's another Real Life Buyer podcast. I do hope you enjoyed it and it's given you some ideas and inspiration for greater action and achievement. If you are a purchasing or a supply chain professional, business owner or director, come and join my Facebook group, the Purchasing and Supply Chain Community Hub, a safe place to engage with like-minded, friendly people. See you soon. Bye.